Good morning, everyone. We're so happy to have you here for our monthly SBI Resilience Speaker Series. We do have a listserv for people who are interested in resilience-informed practices in higher education. That listserv is called the CURE, C-U-R-E, which stands for Colleges and Universities for Resilience. And if you would like to add it to our listserv, please go ahead and type your email in the listserv, in the chat, and we can add you eventually within a couple days. My name is Wallace Dixon, and I am the director of the ETSU Ballad Health Strong Brain Institute. The ETSU Ballad Health Strong Brain Institute was founded by a $1 million 5-year gift to ETSU from Ballad Health, and I'm truly honored to be asked to help lead and build the organization. The majority of Americans have experienced at least one major adverse experience at some point in their childhood. At ETSU specifically, 1 in 4 of our students have lived through or may still be living through 3 or more major adverse experiences. The goal of the Strong Brain Institute is to use the science of childhood adversity coupled with mitigation science and resilience science to prevent and mitigate the negative impacts of ACEs on children's and adults' lives, and to promote awareness in the use of resilience-informed procedures and policies, both at ETSU and throughout the Appalachian Highlands region. We are a resource for people to turn to when they have questions about how best to employ resilience-informed strategies and practices in their workspaces. We are truly blessed today to have 2 of the nation's leaders in promoting resilience-informed practices in higher education, Dr. Phyllis Thompson and Dr. Janice Carello. At this point, I'd like to hand over the mic to Dr. Thompson, who is not only our expert in resilience-informed higher education practices, but also a member of our steering committee in the Strong Brain Institute.
Thank you, Wally. We call our steering committee the steering wheel, and I just love that. I love getting to say that I'm on the steering wheel of the Strong Brain Institute. And Janice and I are so delighted to be here. I'm going to share my screen. I'm delighted to see everybody warming up the chat, saying good morning and introducing yourself. So definitely take this time, if you didn't hear earlier, to introduce yourself, to tell your affiliation, so we know who all is in our conversation, and also to give your email address if you would like to, if you'd like to hear back from us. And I'm going to share my screen and ask you if you can see what I can see, which is our title page, How Centering Student Learning Helps Promote Compassion and Prevent Burnout. So I'm Phyllis Thompson. I'm interim chair of Counseling and Human Services here at ETSU, and have served as the director of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies for about 10 years. My co-editor and colleague and friend, Dr. Janice Carello, is joining me today. Janice has her PhD from the University of Buffalo. She is a associate professor and the program director of the MSW program at Pennsylvania West University. And she also, by the way, has a certificate in trauma counseling. You know, I first met Janice on paper. I've got to tell you this. I first met Janice on paper, looking for ways to not just understand trauma-informed theory, but to do trauma-informed practice. And I found Janice Carello. I found her trauma-informed teaching blog. And then I found her essay, Potentially Perilous Pedagogies, Teaching Trauma is Not the Same as Trauma-Informed Teaching. And it really revolutionized my practice. And later I found her book, Trauma and Human Rights, Integrating Approaches to Address Trauma, to Address Human Rights. The Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies Steering Committee and I were doing some work around trauma-informed care at ETSU and got a grant to do an institute. And so I had met Janice on paper and I called her to ask if she would keynote our institute. And so then we finally got to meet each other in person, well, at least on Zoom. And then speed forward to the pandemic. And I called her up again and said, Janice, I really want to work on this project, work on this book that I need to read right now. And would you be a part of that? Would you collaborate on that with me? And she said, fortunate for me, she said yes, and we've continued our relationship. We've collaborated with some of the most excellent scholars around the country to produce 2 books. The first one was Lessons from the Pandemic, Trauma-Informed Approaches to College Crisis and Change. And the second one, which is kind of what we're focusing on today, is Trauma-Informed Pedagogies, a guide to responding to crisis and inequality in higher education. And so that's kind of our path. And reason I wanted to tell you that story is our path has been a conversation. And that's what we hope to have with you today, is a conversation that builds on conversations in process and that are in progress, particularly Dr. Diana Moreland's talk in the fall, where she presented resilience in the face of burnout. Her talk showed that levels of burnout and threats to personal and professional well-being have increased during the pandemic and since then. She overviewed risk factors for us and highlighted resilience building strategies to prevent burnout. Janice, back in the spring, and I want to move my slide forward. So there, whoops. I'm not sure how to go backwards. Ben, how do I go backwards?
Can you press the left arrow key?
Try it. Thank you. Yeah, there. So Janice found this tweet back in the spring that I think really describes how a lot of us are feeling. Professoring during COVID is basically just responding with, yes, no problem, just take care of yourself, over and over and over again, while triaging our own household and asking for extensions for our own work repeatedly and wondering when we finally get to come up for air. What we've seen talking to other professors and colleagues and administrators is that professoring during COVID has left us with decreased bandwidth and increased burnout. But at the same time, I see many of the folks that I see in the blocks on the screen. I see you at the QEP meetings to discuss student engagement. Then I see you an hour later at the Moonshot Town Hall to talk about equity gaps. A couple days later after that, we'll all be in a room discussing diversity, equity, and inclusion to talk about student success and belonging. And so one of the things that I'm seeing is that while there is certainly decreased bandwidth, there's also this increased and continued commitment to compassion and care for our students. And so what we want to do today is talk about how we can center student learning and also engage in self-care, how we can maintain rigor in our classrooms while still offering flexibility. We want to talk about how we can build safety and belonging and care into our assignments for our students, but also into our policies and procedures for ourselves. So in other words, how can we offer empathy to our students, but at the same time offer self-compassion for us? In our time together today, our hope is that we can show and have a conversation with you about how an equity-centered, trauma-informed approach provides a framework for asking these kinds of questions to assess our own practice and provide principles to guide that practice. And note, I didn't say that we had a framework that tells you exactly what to do, or that we have a framework and we're going to tell you, exact directives. We have a framework that helps us ask questions to assess our practice. The slides for our presentation, you'll be able to get those at the end of the presentation. We also, at the end of our book, Trauma Informed Pedagogies, we have a toolbox of evidence-based trauma-informed practices from scholars and practitioners around the United States. And there will be a link provided to you at the end that has that toolbox totally free of charge. So you'll be able to click on that and go to Palgrave Macmillan's website and download that toolbox. And there are some amazing scholars and some amazing tools about how to trauma inform our practice. Definitely continue to use the chat or raise your hand or just say, hey, I've got a question while we're going. We'll also have some time at the end for you to ask questions as well. And I also wanted to mention that there's an evaluation survey at the end. So, so definitely fill that out for us and give us some feedback. Let me turn it over to Janice.
So we're going to start today with a brief activity, and it may seem like, why are they doing this? This makes absolutely no sense, but I promise we'll tie it in when we get to after a few slides. The scenario I'm going to have you imagine right now as we go over the next few slides is that you are going to be invited to attend a party, and you're going to be receiving some information about this party. And in the chat, we're going to invite you on a scale of 0 to 10, 0 meaning not at all eager to attend this party, and 10 meaning I am there. We're going to ask you to rate your responses as we go along. So here's the first one. And this one, the information we're getting is, it's party time, exclamation point. Right? In the chat, as you're reading through the little bit of information on this slide, how eager would you be to attend this party? We know the date. We don't know the time. I don't know the location. I do know they want me to bring a dish to pass. There's food, so Chris is in. Wally's like, no, not at all eager. 3. So we got some low scores. Some people I think are like, it's a party, I'm going, right? I don't need an excuse to go to a party, but some lower ones. And I'm wondering, and my guess is that for many of us, there's just not a lot of information here. I am not a party person. I am very introverted. So I would kind of like a little bit more information about this and to be a little bit more clear about what's going to be expected. And I don't even know who to contact with this. So my scores are probably going to be similar to many of yours, and they're going to be a little bit low. How about this next one? Okay, so this one, I've got the invitation. I'm still seeing some excited exclamation points. I know what it's for. I've got the date. I've got the time, got the location. I know to RSVP what might be expected of me and who to contact. What are your ratings for this one? I'm seeing some 5s, 4s, 8s. Some of us are still like, it's still a party. I'm not sure, but I'm seeing higher scores on this one. And my guess is that, right, similar to you, I'm having a similar reaction. I'm feeling a little better about that one. Oops, we're going through some extra slides. Sorry. There we go. Oh, back there we go. Thank you, Phyllis. We have more information. This is much clearer to me. And so I have more of a sense of what's going to happen, what's expected, and I know who to contact if I have any questions. Again, I'm still not much of a party person. It's still COVID. I might be a little bit nervous about that, but I'm feeling a little better about this one. How about the next one? Party reminder, don't be late. Okay, this exclamation point feels a little different to me on this one, and I'll be curious to see your ratings. The door is locked promptly at 7 p.m. and I'm never going to be invited again if I'm late. I'm seeing some 0s, 1s, 3s. Some people are like, it's party and I'm not a late person, right? That may be affecting some of this, but I'm seeing much lower scores again. My guess is that, right, similar kind of reaction, like it's starting to make me a little bit nervous, even if I'm not someone who's normally late. I know there's probably a good reason for this, but it's feeling a little bit less like a party that I would want to attend. How about the next one? Did you read the invitation? It clearly says if you signed up for the party that you have to bring a dish that serves at least 30 people, and it can't be stored in plastic, and you can't have nuts, sugar, dairy, gluten, meat, shellfish, food dyes, preservatives, or alcohol. And if you don't have prior approval, I'm seeing lots of zeros. I'm seeing a -4, right? And I get this one, right? My guess is that someone hosted a party and that there was someone who had an allergy to something and got sick. And so they are trying very hard to make sure that this doesn't happen again and that no one gets harmed. Unfortunately, I think the way that this is phrased is probably not conveying that as well as they would like. And it's clearly turning many of you off in the chat with your low ratings. How about this last one? How come you never come to my parties anymore? You have to come. Don't you know how much money I spent? And I did all this time decorating. And if you don't come, then other people aren't going to come. And then what am I going to do? Cancel? Why do I even bother with these parties? And I'm seeing lots of zeros and I'm exaggerating, quite a bit with these. You probably don't get anything in email that sounds exactly like this. And as some of you may have guessed as we go along, I don't know about you, but I have certainly seen and I have written policies and communications and assignments that use this kind of wording in the past, because sometimes, right, despite our best intentions, right, and right, how this relates to our syllabi and our assignments, despite our best intentions, sometimes the way that we are interacting, our policies and procedures are not having the desired effect. Right, that one of the things that we know from trauma-informed approaches is that we need to, continuously reassess our policies, our practices, our procedures, and look at the way standard operating procedures may sometimes create barriers to access to services. And in our case, those services are education. Phyllis, you want to go to the next slide? So again, we're going to be talking about an invitation to reassess our policies through this trauma-informed lens. We're not going to go into a lot of details. We do want to provide just enough about the framework that we're using and what the foundation for us so that you have an understanding of where we're coming from. So we're going to go over just a couple of trauma-informed basics. The next slide, Phyllis. So we're talking about trauma-informed care, we're talking about trauma and experiences of trauma. And there are different definitions of trauma, and I'm not going to go into all of them. Again, that was not the main point of this presentation, but so that we're all on the same page, whichever definitions of trauma that we are using, what they have in common is that we're talking about a response to an event or a series of events that are experienced as threatening and that leave us with negative consequences, negative effects, right? One of the ways that Judith Herman talks about it in her seminal text, Trauma and Recovery, is that traumatic events overwhelm the ordinary systems of care that give people a sense of control, connection, and meaning. And why this quote has always stood out for me is because it's not, we're talking about trauma, it's not just how it affects us as individual and disrupts our own individual senses of control, connection, and meaning. But as we've seen, particularly through the pandemic, it also disrupts on an institutional level our sense of control, connection, and meaning. And so what Phyllis and I are going to be talking a lot about today are ways to restore that sense of control, connection, and meaning. Next slide. Back to you, Phyllis. You're on mute.
Thanks, Janice. I love this slide because this image, because what it highlights is that based on our location, we may have different terms for doing the same thing. All the guys on this boat are all going downstream. They're all doing the same thing, paddling downstream. But according to where they are sitting in the boat, according to their location, according to their job, they're doing different paddle strokes. The guys in the front are digging in because they're the gas pedal. They're getting ready to go down a big drop. There's a big hole. It's going to be violent, and they're getting a lot of speed to make it. The guy on the very back is the steering wheel. That person is moving the front of the boat so they have direction. The guy you see on the left is freaking out because he sees the hole. But no matter what, from each of the locations, they're all doing the same thing, but they might call what they're doing forward strokes, rudders, freaking out, different things. And the same is the case in the work that we do. We might have different names for things. We might call the work we do trauma informed or trauma sensitive or trauma aware, healing centered or resilient work or mindfulness. But we all share the same and common values. Our trauma-informed approaches to realize the widespread prevalence and impact of trauma, to recognize signs and symptoms of trauma, to respond by integrating knowledge about trauma into our policy and into our practice, and to resist traumatizing the people that we work with, promoting resilience and growth instead. So in relation to higher education and the work we do in higher education, trauma-informed approaches is about making education accessible and making our classroom one that Bruce Perry might call that's safe enough to learn. So while we might call these things something different, we share the same values.
So with this approach, many of us are very aware on this call of the widespread impact of adverse and traumatic experiences in higher education. So we're not going to go over a ton of information on that. But the part about this, with this foundation, it's still also important to understand what trauma looks like and be able to recognize the signs and symptoms. And so even though we're going to be focusing more on responding and resisting re-traumatization, we do want to spend a few minutes on talking about how to recognize distress in college settings, right, Phyllis? So what I'm going to do is invite you again to use the chat and to let us know, what are you seeing in your classrooms that tells you that your students are stressed? What are the signs that you are noticing in your own classrooms? And as you add those, I'm going to just go over the image that's here and let you know what's on it, because it may be hard to see. It's a chart that shows a continuum of thriving with the thought, I've got this, to surviving, noticing something isn't right, to struggling, I can't keep this up, to in crisis, I can't survive this. And it gives some general indicators of what this might look like. And then if you would, in the chat, if any of you have some ideas that you will share with us, what does it look, what are some signs that your students are struggling and that they're stressed? A huge sign for Melody is avoidance. Yes, previously engaged students, they stop emailing, they stop turning in work, stop attending class. Students who usually are participating are not attending, mood swings, short tempers, defensive responses, absolutely. A change in level of eye contact, that's a very observant one. Yeah. 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 We get and often the ghosting. The avoidance is a big one, and we know that that's a hallmark of trauma. Yes, and some of the others that you've mentioned, Bethesda just mentioned, always in a hurry, that we'll see some of those types of reactions. Also, people get more agitated, those mood swings, fatigue, right? Yep. Next slide, Phyllis. And so I don't know about you, I usually have either students who are emailing me a ton more, or they're not emailing me at all. And it sounds like you're having some similar experiences. They either ghost us, or they're just, it's an email every 20 minutes, right? Some people are talking about inappropriate responses. Yes, some common responses we'll see that you've noted: a marked decline in performance, excessive absences, a change in appearance or behavior from how it was before. We're seeing some additional ones asking lots of late requests. I'm seeing that a lot at my college also for late work. Students may not be responsive to communication. They may be disruptive, as you're noting, exaggerated responses, depression, even some confusion, right? In addition to all of the things that you've been noting. So it's not just us, right? It's not just us individually. We're noticing this collectively. Repeated requests for grace. We're going to give you some tips for dealing with that, because when you're getting inundated with them, that can certainly contribute to our own sense of burnout. Another thing that we want to think about from a trauma-informed lens is that we're not just paying attention to our students' stress and our students' trauma histories, right? We educators have stress also. We have trauma histories also. So it's also learning to pay attention to our own stress. So on this slide here, and then I'm going to invite you again in the chat, what are some signs that you notice that you are too stressed? There are several on the slide here. I'll go over a few of them. They're worded in a way that may sound a little bit humorous. I resemble all of these remarks that, yeah, sometimes it's really hard to get to my email or even, get out of bed. The one that in particularly resonates with me is that I think I will go insane if people don't stop chewing so loudly. I have misophonia, and when I am highly stressed, my spouse cannot chew quietly enough. I invite you to share any of yours in the chat. Rude, angry, destructive, persevere. Yeah, you keep going even though you know you need to take a break, right? Probably you resemble some of the things from your students. You may go into avoidance mode with some things more, right? Streaming, yeah, way too much internet streaming. Thinking about retirement hourly. Yep. And so it's helpful to be able to recognize our own sources of stress, and we'll talk about how, right? It's not because there's anything wrong with us. It's just that we want to pay attention to that so that we can know how to effectively intervene and how to let others know how to support us. Exhaustion, tiredness, dreaming of vacation. I resemble all of those remarks also. Irritability, feeling like you have nothing left to give. That exhaustion that we saw, that we are even noticing in our students. Again, so normalizing this, right? But paying attention to it and thinking about how we interpret it. Next slide, Phyllis. Some common signs of secondary traumatic stress, vicarious trauma, and burnout. So some things, especially if we've been doing this for a while and we've been in circumstances where these kinds of stressors are chronic, we may start to notice some persistent or excessive anger or guilt or feelings of hopelessness in relation to a student or in relation to a colleague and who we're aware of a past or current suffering of theirs. We may get angry with our students or colleagues, right? We may be, telling rotten jokes about them, right, as a way to let off some steam. We may be preoccupied with one or more of them because we know about their circumstances. We may develop an excessive interest in some of the details of their suffering and find ourselves more curious than we would have thought we would have been about it. We may engage in some rescue fantasies or think that we can somehow fix something. We may experience some physical symptoms such as headaches or sleeplessness, intrusive imagery. We may have some emotional numbing or difficulty trusting other people. And then when we get really burned out, we may have the feeling like nothing we're doing makes a difference and things really feel kind of hopeless. And again, the message with this is these are things to be aware of, right? These are normal things that can happen when we're under chronic stress. But the message is not that there's something wrong with us, right? It's like with the trauma-informed approach, what has happened that has led to us experiencing these symptoms, right? And so when we're talking about being trauma-informed, we're shifting our focus so that instead of focusing on individuals and pathology and thinking in terms of what's wrong with people, which positions trauma as a kind of disorder or impairment, we start shifting our focus to the environment and the person in the environment and what has happened to lead to these behaviors and to these types of symptoms and coping. And that way that positions trauma as a kind of injury or an obstacle that one must overcome. Next slide. So as Phyllis was talking again, all roads lead back to then the purpose is to help make meaning or help make learning accessible for students. Next slide. And then so one way that we can think about that, some of you may be familiar with the window of tolerance. And so one way that we help make learning accessible is to understand the impact of these types of historical traumas, current traumas, and adversity on people's nervous systems, right, on the body. And so in this slide, what we have is in the center, the window of tolerance. And we know that ideally for learning to happen, right, we want people to feel present, calm, safe, right? In this state, they can think and respond clearly. They're more engaged and alert, right? This overriding sense that I am safe and what I'm linking with a connective style. We know that sometimes students or even ourselves, we can show up in the learning space and we may already be either on the edge right? Or something can happen that makes us feel threatened. When people feel threatened, their prefrontal cortex goes offline, right? And they prepare to defend themselves. Then we see people in a hyper aroused state. So they might go into a fight or flight response where there's emotional reactivity. There are physiological symptoms like sweaty palms, increased heart rate. People have difficulty concentrating. They may experience things like panic or rage and hypervigilance as they prepare to defend themselves against that threat, which I'm associating here with a more directive style. And if we think back to those invitations, right, we see that kind of language that's associated with that. On the other end, when the threat has been extended, sometimes people, it doesn't seem like it would make any sense to engage in fight or flight or defend themselves. And so they surrender, right? They kind of have this sense that nothing they do makes a difference and go into a hypo-aroused state. And here's what we think of the freeze and sometimes the appease response also. People are more low energy. They're conserving energy so that they can get out of the situation and survive it, right? And just get away from it. There may be numb, a lack of emotion, less physical movement, zoning out, what we think of in terms of dissociating and shut down. Alternately, people might go into that appease response where they are going along to get along, right? They're just yesing you until they can get out of the conversation with you. The one thing that I want to stress with that too, and that's fine, stay on this slide, Phyllis, you can stay, it doesn't matter, is that in that connective place, right, that sometimes people are going to get threatened, that despite our best intentions, it may have nothing to do with us, right? That people are going to feel that sense of threat, and they're not always going to stay in that connective mode. But what we're trying to do with our policies and practices using this trauma-informed lens is to create a space that helps people to re-regulate, right? And including ourselves, right? So some characteristics. So many of us are familiar with authority styles. So I usually link this information to that to kind of help us digest it. We'll be referring to that other places in the presentation also. But when we're talking about these different authority styles, a directive authority style demonstrates high expectations. There are clear rules, but there may be a tendency towards punishment for rule breaking. More rigid boundaries, more aggressive communication. There may be a tendency towards power over and an attitude of because I said so. That doesn't mean that in crisis, it's not helpful to be directive sometimes. We're just thinking about what happens when that is present all the time, when that is the dominant mode of expression. On the other end, with that hypo-arousal state, we might see more of a permissive type of authority style where there are lower expectations. People are very accepting, but there may be fewer rules or very few rules, more porous boundaries. It's not clear where I start, where you begin, a tendency towards more passive aggressive communication in order to avoid conflict, and an attitude more of you're on your own, right? Remember that feeling of I don't think I can deal with this, right? And that may result in these types of characteristics. And then what we're hoping for with that connective one is more of a power with, right? More assertive communication and more of a helping people feel seen, heard, and valued rather than a I'm mad at you or don't be mad at me that comes across unintentionally. Again, not saying we never go into these other modes or that it's inappropriate, just that it can be helpful to stay in this mode. But I'm curious if you're willing to share that information. I will invite you in the chat to let us know which authority styles were modeled for you in college. What did you see? Feel free to abbreviate with DC or P. Some C's, wonderful. I am so glad to see so many C's. Just loads of response time, all of them, some D's. Mostly C's, D's and C's, more directive, a fair amount of all of them. There's a combo usually, right? And sometimes even in the same instructor, sometimes probably. Yeah, thank you for sharing those. Yeah, for me, I saw a mix. I did tend to see directive and permissive, and sometimes I would see one person going back and forth between those particular styles. But also I was glad to have people model for me that more connective style. Now the harder question, which authority styles do you think you rely upon as an educator? So if you're thinking about your course evaluations and about the ways that your students respond, what types of styles do you think you rely upon? I'm seeing a C, C and P, C, P. Yeah, full disclosure here. So if you look at any of mine, I definitely strive for C. My tendency, particularly when I was first teaching, was more permissive. And I could tell by the feedback I got that is what would happen. Sometimes too, it's just not a good fit with students. So on my course evaluations, even though I would have students who were saying, I know Janice wants us to, or I know Professor Carello wants us to self-manage, I wish she would tell me what to do. So what's going to happen sometimes is I had to look at that and say, am I being too permissive? Am I giving too many choices, right? Or is it maybe that this person may be used to a more directive style and they're using that to compensate for their own more hypo-aroused style? Right? But I have to reassess that, and I use that information to do that. Ideally C with a D wing. Yeah, and again, sometimes we're going to go back and forth. It's going to depend on the situation. C on a good day, P if I'm feeling insecure, yeah, or overwhelmed, right? And so knowing what style that, even if this is more congruent with a trauma-informed approach, even if I know that, what is my tendency when I'm under stress, right? And then how do I make adjustments for that? Phyllis, want to keep going? And so one way I attended a webinar recently that just was absolutely wonderful by Dr. Nikki Elliott, and she was using polyvagal theory to talk about embodied equity. And so one way that she talks about this, and I have a great article, if you're interested, email me, I will send that to you. Because she goes into so much more detail and it's beautiful. But one way, her background is in K-12 education, but she's applying this to K-16, is that she helps us understand that in order for students to be able to reason or learn, right, they have to be able to regulate first and have a sense of safety. They also have to have a sense of belonging and be able to relate to others, and that those two conditions must be present in order for learning to happen. Right? And she goes into a lot more other details, and also paying attention to this and understanding that the threats to safety and threats to belonging, particularly they may be things like stereotype threat also, that those types of interpersonal threats can impact learning also. And so she quotes Stephen Porges, who is one of the originators of polyvagal theory. And one of the things that he talks about that I'm highlighting here is he reminds us that we can't just avoid causing harm. We also have to actively cue safety and reduce defensiveness. And from a trauma-informed perspective, I'm reminding myself that I need to do that for myself also, so that I can model that for students and help create that kind of space. Phyllis? You're on mute.
There. Thank you, Janice. Yeah, so as we cue safety and mitigate threat that creates barriers for learning, I want us to remember that we all have common values, even as we sit in different locations and maybe call these different tasks that we do by different names, but we still have different values. We still have the same values in our work. One of the things that Heidi Marsh and I worked on when we were thinking about, how is it that we use a trauma-informed approach to make education accessible? One of the things we started thinking about was the way that the different principles, SAMHSA's principles of a trauma-informed care, work in relationship to one another. And we reconceptualized SAMHSA's list, which is a hierarchical list from starting with safety, going in a line down to cultural, historic, and gender issues. We reconceptualized that as a wheel and as a wheel of practice. And we did that because we felt like it highlighted the relationships between the principles, but it also shifts to a more dynamic view of our practice that mirrors what we know about trauma response and trauma recovery as nonlinear. And so on our wheel of practice, this is we see this as a series of questions for thinking about trauma-informed approaches from at the center of our wheel or our hub is cultural, historic, and gender issues. And so as we change locations, culture, historic trauma, gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity, religion, age, how does safety look different? Or how does trust look different? Or what is peer support when you move across population groups? And so our work has been to think about each of these principles moving across population groups and how an intersectional approach helps us mitigate the threats or barriers to learning more appropriately for different groups that we're working with. And so the larger wheel looks something like this in the book. And what I'd like to do is talk to you a little bit, just tell you a little bit about briefly what each of these principles are. I won't exhaust this, but I'll go into briefly describe each one, and then some questions that this wheel of practice might suggest that we ask to start thinking about how we can do, let's say, safety from an intersectional approach. So, as we're moving through these, definitely use the chat to tell us what you're already doing, because I know you're already doing a lot of this work and doing it well, and it'd be nice to capture that as well. And so we have two questions. What are the principles that guide our practice? And how does using an intersectional approach help us re-see each of these principles to make education accessible? So safety is the first of the principles, and it's the bedrock or foundational principle of a trauma-informed approach. It asks us to create a safe environment, a safe physical, social, and interpersonal environment. Bruce Perry would say, is your environment one that's safe enough to learn in? Is it predictable? Does it allow us to, Brene Brown might say, to take off our armor and be vulnerable and speak without fear of being punished or speak without fear of being judged? And so one of the things that we might think about using an equity-centered approach, or an approach that uses an intersectional lens of culture, gender, and historic issues, to think about our class or our syllabus or our processes and procedures in our offices. Does our use of our syllabus or our processes promote predictability? Does our syllabus foster true belonging and invite people to celebrate their authentic selves? Have we created a shame-free zone in our classroom? Ways that we might do this is provide regular updates and announcements or overviews. We might create comfort agreements at the very beginning of our semester. We honor preferred names. We avoid dead naming, and we invite pronouns, but we don't require them. And we give grace. We're flexible. Trustworthiness and transparency is the second principle. Charles Feltman, who's a well-being coach and wrote The Thin Book of Trust, writes that trust is choosing to make something important to you valuable to the vulnerable to the actions of somebody else. So transparency is the vehicle for building and maintaining trust. Or as Brene Brown reminds us, trust is like a jar of marbles and is built one marble at a time. Trust is not the big thing that you do in the course of the year. It's the little everyday actions that you have with people 365 days a year. And so we ask ourselves, the wheel of practice gets us, Heidi and I wanted us to start thinking about what are some of the questions that we want to ask our syllabus or our processes and procedures? Does our syllabus cultivate relationships based on consistency in our ability to be compassionate and to be curious? Do our processes establish boundaries as a way to maintain relationships, but not restrict them? So in an equity-centered, trauma-informed approach to trust, we want to think about how we can admit our mistakes, how we might want to confront privilege as we're building healing relationships, and how we want to openly acknowledge our own limits, to acknowledge that we just don't know what we don't know. Peer support, peers are individuals who are living with an experience of trauma, and they are key to establishing safety, to building trust, to creating collaboration, and using similar experiences and life stories to promote recovery and healing. And so how does my classroom make space for peer interactions to happen, or encourage peer mentoring, peer revision? How does it enhance our ability to care for one another across lines of difference? So we want to consider the equity impact of meeting times or social activities that we offer. I mean, is the 8 o'clock meeting going to work equally well for the chair of the department, as well as the assistant professor who has childcare to get to? Want to be able to ask one another, how can I support you? We want to provide informational opportunities to build connections. Collaboration and mutuality recognizes power differences and levels them. Centers relationships as the location of healing. Healing happens in relationship. And we know that we need to share power and decision-making and affirm that one another, each one of us have a different role to play. So how in my classroom do I invite feedback, or how in my department meetings do I invite feedback? How do I hold space for difference, discomfort, or disagreement without shoving it under the rug, but actually pausing and letting that be part of the conversation? How do we share decision-making where everyone's contribution is invited, heard, and valued? And so we think about mechanisms for feedback and follow-up, for strategies for cultivating difficult conversations, recognizing that they're difficult, owning that they're difficult, but having a strategy for having that conversation rather than just going straight to shutting it down, normalizing difficulty, and co-creating. And empowerment, voice, and choice is promoting agency and mentoring self-advocacy skills, helping our students, for instance, learn how to advocate for themselves, or the assistant professors in our department. Amplifying voice and embedding choices and sharing decision-making. And so the wheel of practice asks us to think about respect and encouraging agency, about ensuring that, asking the question about the choices that we give, either our students or members of our department. Are they real choices, or are they coercive? And what kind of assumptions are we making about staff or students' availability? So we want to facilitate activities that honors everyone's participation and offers multiple ways to show up and to speak up, whether that's in a classroom or in a departmental meeting. We want to think about what are some creative alternatives to assignments, and what are some creative options to completing them. And how can we establish boundaries, clarify responsibilities, and offer flexibility around attendance, due dates, revisions, and other types of assignments and policies in our syllabi.
And then, so we've gone over some more generalities. So this is how we are applying what we've been learning about the principles of trauma-informed care, how we apply that to higher education more generally. And so now what Phyllis and I are going to do is talk about in more concrete terms, giving you more concrete skills and strategies and examples of how we're applying it that you may use for inspiration. And again, we'll continue to invite you to share information and share examples of what you're doing in the chat. Again, we're thinking about how we can help reestablish a sense of connection, control, and meaning. Next slide, Phyllis. And so one of the things that we're talking about when thinking about creating assignments, when creating a syllabus, is we want to think about how we set the tone, right? So if our goal is to create spaces that are safe enough to take risks and to make mistakes and learn from them, right, for our students and for ourselves also, what are some strategies we can use to set the tone for that? Next slide. And I'm gonna, so my thing is always to start with empathy. That would be my best piece of advice, start with empathy. So I've got a scenario here for you that may sound familiar. I want you to imagine that you have a student who is sharing either in a very loud, angry voice, or maybe they're even crying. Why did I get such a bad grade on this test? I've never gotten a grade like this before. It's gonna mess up my GPA and my scholarship. And now what am I gonna do? Next slide. And in the chat, if you want to type in a number, which of these 6 responses sound the most like empathy to you? Type in the number. First one is, you should study more next time. 2 is, don't worry, you're passing the course. 3, I'm sorry you failed the test. 4, how did you fail the test if you studied? 5, technically a D is passing. 6, it sounds like you're really disappointed with your grade. I am seeing a lot of 6s here. So you have got this. Yes. Next slide. Right. That we start with the empathizing. Every other one of these responses has absolutely come out of my mouth, and it may again, right? Because sometimes we do still need to provide some advice to students, or we do need to correct them. But what I find is that if I start with 6 first, if I start with empathy first, students are going to be more receptive to anything else I have to say, and they're going to feel seen, heard, and valued. Next slide. And we know that's working because then people, their defenses drop. We can often see a visible release of tension, and then they're not talking at us like they used to, right? So we can kind of tell how our response has landed, and we can look for that, and we might feel that ourselves even. Next slide. Next scenario, right? Practicing self-compassion. So this new scenario, I want you to imagine that you are 3 weeks behind in your grading, and you're saying to yourself in a loud, angry voice, or while sobbing, how did I get so far behind again? I've never been this far behind before. Students are going to complain. They're going to complain to the chair and the dean. Next slide. Which of these demonstrates self-compassion? So I'm going to invite you to use the chat again. Which of these sound like they are being empathetic with ourselves? You should grade 5 papers a day next time. Don't worry, you're tenured. I'm sorry you're so far behind again. How did you get this far behind again? Technically, it's only been 2.5 weeks. It sounds like you're feeling really overwhelmed and disappointed with grading right now. I'm seeing a lot of 6s on this one, but I don't know about you all. If I'm being honest, I'm not doing 6 before I do a lot of 1 through 5, and I have to do a lot of 5 through 1 right before I get to 6 sometimes. And the point with this is that, again, when we're talking about being trauma-informed, we're also thinking about creating spaces for us as educators also, and that it can be helpful to practice that self-compassion, not only because it helps model for students, right, but it helps us to experience less burnout. It does 6, but it doesn't reduce the negative self-talk. I know it's hard to start with 6, Jean, isn't it? It really is. Next slide. Another skill that can be really helpful that I've personally found very helpful is validation. And this one was a little bit tricky for me, right? We know intellectually that if we use scolding or sarcastic or defensive language, that people are going to get defensive. They're going to put their energy into defending themselves, right? Instead of solving a conflict. But it can be hard sometimes to feel like we want to validate because it feels like we are somehow agreeing with the other person, even if we don't. And validation is not about agreeing with, it's just validating the other person's reality, right? And helping them know that you understand where they're coming from. I've highlighted some phrases on the slide, which you'll get a copy of. And so phrases I find myself using a lot with students and with colleagues. I can certainly understand whatever it is they're presenting to me. I can certainly understand why you would want to do X or why you're asking me to do X. Doesn't mean I can do it, doesn't mean I agree with it, but I can understand why they are asking for it. And I'll let people know, right? I know this is, especially if I have to disappoint them, I know this isn't what you're wanting to hear, and I'm sorry that I can't grant your request. Thank you for sharing your concerns, and I'm still on the same page with you, right? Let me know if I can be of further assistance. We are still in relationship with one another. I am on your side. Next slide. Another thing that I've been using a lot too, like Phyllis and I have been talking a lot about how we can take from a lot of different sources in order to do this work because we share similar values. And we can get skills and ideas from lots of places. One for me is Marshall Rosenberg's nonviolent communication. And then the model for that is you make an observation instead of a judgment, state the feeling, identify the need, and then make a request for behavior change. When such and such happens, I feel this way because this really matters to me. Would you be willing to do X? Next slide. An example for that in educational spaces, right? Observation. When you don't turn your work in on time, I get concerned because it really matters to me that you succeed in this course. Would you be willing to meet with me to discuss how you can get caught up? Right? Lets people know that you still have high expectations for them, right? But it's done in a way that's empowering. You can also do this to show appreciation. Thank you for your email. Your well-being and success in this course are important to me. I'm relieved to hear you're feeling better now. We'll be happy to chat about how to get caught up. Again, it's not being just dismissive here of the concern, it's acknowledging it, and it's setting the expectation that you can get caught up and that you will do the work for this course. Next slide. Another thing that we learned from nonviolent communication strategies is using I statements. So instead of using judgments, we make observations. So instead of you made me mad, Phyllis, when you click, it should do the next one. I felt angry. We need to talk. I would like to talk. You ignored the directions. I don't see the required elements. This doesn't make sense. I'm going to invite you in the chat. What about the this doesn't make sense? What else could we say instead? I'm feeling confused. Yeah. I don't understand. I need more clarity. The reality is that I need more clarity. You guys are awesome at this. How about you're wrong? Walk me through your logic. I love that one. Any suggestions for you're wrong? How might we say it as an observation? And then also and seeing if anybody has a suggestion for that, let's look at this a different way. Yes, please let me know what you're saying, right? You're wrong, right? I have a different perspective. I have evidence that tells me that this may not be a true statement, right? The I. And this can be challenging in a syllabus. I've gone through my syllabus to look at where I'm saying you need to do this. Students must do this. And I'm wagging my finger because that's how I imagine it comes off to students when I'm saying it. And it's been a real challenge to go into my syllabus and think of where can I put I statements? I need to see X in order for me to give you this grade. I need you to do this with submitting a file, right? And that's been a real challenge. Next slide. Making requests versus making demands of students, because demands, they emphasize obedience, right? The emphasis then is on an obedience model. Students may feel that they have to comply or rebel. It implies that there's wrongdoing if they don't comply, which can be very discouraging. And when we make requests using this nonviolent communication model that emphasizes compassion, it shows empathy for others' needs, it respects our needs and takes responsibility for those, and is often perceived as more empowering. Next slide. Another thing that can be challenging but helpful as we think about giving feedback on assignments, particularly as we start moving towards different types of formative feedback, is using, giving that feedback instead of giving so much advice. So advice, we're talking about an opinion or a suggestion for what to do. For example, you should have cited at least 3 sources, or you should visit a tutor, versus feedback, which is information about progress toward a goal, right? If we're encouraging students to make mistakes and learn from them, that feedback is essential. You have not yet cited the required number of sources. What would you like to do about that? Okay. Tutoring services are available if you're interested. That assumes that I'm not telling you there's something wrong with you and that you need to go see a tutor. Just saying, if you would like to learn more about how to cite in APA style, here's where you can go find out how to do that. Next slide. Here we have another scenario. So I want you to imagine that a student is confiding in you that they've been out of school for years and they're not feeling confident at all that they can get good grades and finish their degree. In the chat, if you are willing to play along, give that student some advice. What would your opinion be about what they should do to manage this situation? What might advice look like? I don't see it the same way. Tell me more. I wonder if that's kind of, you're asking them to explain it, but you're disagreeing, right? So it might look like, just stick it out. If you work hard and put your mind to it, you're going to do great. Yeah, I'm hamming it up a little bit, but right. Yeah. You should definitely, right, and any statement that's going to say, here's what you should do. I know what you should do, right? We want to fix it for them, right? If we think about where that place is, we want to reassure them and fix it for them. Get organized, use your resources. You'll be able to do it. I'm here to assist you, right? Providing resources. We have resources. Yep. How about if you're giving feedback about information toward a goal? Some of you got a mix of advice and feedback going on here, don't you? Right? If you're giving feedback versus advice, yes, we have resources available to assist you if you would need it, right? It may not be a great time for them to finish their degree, and you telling them that it is, right, may not actually be helpful, but pointing them to resources and letting them know what's available or talking it through with them to help them understand pros and cons versus telling them what they should or should not do, right, can be really helpful. Next slide. Phyllis?
Thank you. Yeah, so as we're setting the tone for the semester to get ready to start, we're really cueing safety and connection. Cueing safety and connection is uplifting relationships, uplifting belonging, and enhancing learning, making learning accessible. You know, in my role as interim chair for the past year, a little more, the biggest complaint that I've received from students is response time. So writing me and said, my professor has not emailed me back, or I turned in this paper and it hasn't been graded. You know, and one of the hardest things that I have to do is, it seems to me, is try to respond in a timely manner when somebody emails me. So this is the big complaint I'm getting from students, and you know, I really empathize because it's so difficult for me to keep up with the massive amounts of emails that I get that are waiting for me every morning when I get to work. And so one of the things that we want to think about is the way that our response time really does cue safety and connection with our students, and really does support their belonging and support us seeing them and hearing them and them feeling like they belong. So attempting to respond in a timely way. Also, as we set the tone for the semester, we can think about use of names and pronouns. I want to give you a scenario for opening of class next week. Picture our initial class setting next Tuesday. And scenario one is that we walk into the classroom, we have our roster with all our students' names on it. And we call out each name just as it's written on the list. In the chat, if you don't mind, how do you feel the attendees, our students, would feel given this approach? As well, how do we as an instructor feel given this approach? Like a number? Yeah. They're going to pronounce my name wrong again. Right. Definitely, Chelsea, anxious, and both as the instructor and as the student. Increasing anxiousness. Yeah, so in terms of creating a safe environment, this is not doing it. And who holds the power in this situation? Yeah, the instructor entirely. I think I see several people putting instructor, instructor, instructor. So what about scenario number two? I'm the instructor of the course. I leave the list of names, my roster, I leave that on the computer, and I ask my students to share their names. So when I do this, how do students feel in that scenario? Yeah, why do I have to introduce myself to strangers for the third time today? That's a good response, because does this put students on the spot? And is this, instead of we were talking about choices versus coercion, is this coercion or is it a choice to introduce yourself? David mentioned they're more concerned about knowing who's here rather than who I am. Embarrassed because they don't want to speak up, especially on that, certainly on the first day. So how would this feel for the instructor? Respected because you recognize it's disrespectful. Who holds the power here? Could they call on someone who doesn't speak up themselves? Faculty. The professor still holds the power because they decided on the ground rules. That's a good point. That's a good point, Wally. Oops. There. The other thing that I might want to mention about scenario number two is that it gives students a choice. Let me go back. It gives students a choice to introduce themselves by their names instead of their names being called out on a list. And for transgender students, faculty, and staff that face unneeded yet common risks of being outed, using the roster on the names, then this is a way to avoid that and to respect students naming themselves. Our introductions set the tone for all of our future interactions in the course. And trans inclusivity during initial introductions reduce harm, trauma, and risk. And it also creates an environment of trust and reciprocal respect. So how do we do this and mitigate some of the problems that you pointed out in the chat? So one of the things that Lars Stolfus mentions, and this is in the toolbox in trauma-informed pedagogies, is that we can ask students on the first day of class to get out a sheet of paper. So instead of introduce yourself for the third time today to everyone else sitting in the room, get out a sheet of paper and start by writing your student ID number. Write your name, write how it's pronounced for us. If you'd like to include your pronouns, include your pronouns and tell me something about how you want me to use them. If you want me to use one set of pronouns during our office meeting and another set of pronouns during our class meetings. Tell me something about you, why you're taking this course, or is there anything I need to know that you want me to keep in mind? Like you're a working mom and your kids might say hi on Zoom if we're having Zoom classes, or your part-time job is really exhausting and frustrating, or you're going to be doodling a lot because that helps you continue to focus. So this does not out students. It also doesn't provide a choice that's really coercive and not a choice at all. And so being inclusive of our trans students helps us promote safety in the classroom. It helps us build trust, and it empowers them to be able to collaborate without fear of being outed or without being dead named. And this kind of process has lots of other applications as well. If you have transnational students in your classroom, it works with that. It works well for those students as well, but multiple applications. We also, Judy mentioned, I believe it was Judy that mentioned, so this, you're asking for students to do something before you've set up rules for the class. And so a great way to start the semester and set the tone for the rest of the semester is to create some comfort agreements with your students to talk about what kind of permissions they need to show up and be available for this course, as well as what does safety and collaboration and mutuality look like for them. And so those would be the comfort agreements about how we do safety and how we hold one another accountable over the course of the semester. And then we want to, during the class, we don't want to do comfort agreements or permission slips and then not check back in with students for the rest of the semester. We want to provide mechanisms for checking back in. One way to do that is exit cards. And so if you have a question during the course of the class today, but you really don't feel like asking it out loud or raising your hand or speaking up today, write your question on a sticky note, put it on the door frame, and I will answer it for you in email as soon as class is over, or at the top of the hour next class, I'll answer that question. That gives students multiple ways to participate in class, to speak up in class without having to raise their hand and enter the conversation if they just don't feel like it on that day. It's important to continue to check in with students, and there's multiple ways to do that. Janice does a wonderful check-in card that she does with students, and she has prompts and asks students to check in, responding to one of the prompts every single week. Another option is to create a Google or a Microsoft Forms form, and it can be an anonymous survey that just asks students, for instance, how can I support you as professor of this class? Or since this class is fully online, what are some things that you're concerned about? It's anonymous, but it gives me insight to how students feel they need my support and what I can actively do to engage them. It also gives me better understanding of, from their location, what are the things that they're really concerned about. And what's really powerful for me is the Microsoft Forms will do a word cloud. And I can put that up. I can show that on the screen in one of our classes. And we can use this as an invitation into conversation about how I can support them and what they need. And so we're normalizing mechanisms of support, and also normalizing that it's a-okay to need support, and it's really great to ask for it when you do. Finally, setting the basket my basket or setting the stage for learning, I take particularly in my gender-based violence class, I take a basket full of all different types of pipe cleaners and crayons and coloring books and clay. You know, in that class, there are lots of triggers. And even when I give trigger warnings, students are still triggered. I mean, I give the warning, but you're still triggered after the warning. And one of the things that I want to teach students is how to self-regulate when they are triggered, so that they can one, own that they're triggered, recognize it, and I recognize it as well, but then find ways to self-regulate and make ourselves continue to be available for the class period. And sometimes that's just excusing yourself and just walking out of the classroom, and that's one of our comfort agreements, that if you need to walk out, we'll just assume that you've gone to the bathroom. But it might be that just playing with the pipe cleaner or doing some coloring might be enough kind of physical embodied manipulation to help you stay present and available for the class period. Janice.
Thank you. So one of the things you've probably seen become kind of clear is that, at least for Phyllis and I, being trauma informed means reevaluating and reassessing and reflecting on how we use authority in the classroom. Many of the models of teaching that we have inherited, right? Many of us were not trained how to be instructors. And so the models that we're using were not necessarily, right? They weren't trauma informed. And so one of the places where some of these, for me at least, the need for more trauma-informed approaches has been in policies. One that's been a big one, and early on I noted, was that I was getting into conflict a lot with students around attendance policies. And what I have here are 3 attendance policies that I've seen. And I'm going to invite you, of these 3, which of the 3 seem trauma-informed to you? And you can just type a number in the chat if you're willing. The first one, oops, go back. Nope. You're going forward. There we go, backwards. First one, attendance is not mandatory and will not be taken. Second one, students who have more than 3 unexcused absences will automatically fail the course. Or the third one, please notify me as soon as you can if you must miss class. If you must miss more than 3 classes, we're going to set up a time to talk about this. I'm in agreement with you on this about 3 seeming the more trauma-informed one. One, if we're thinking back to that permissive versus directive versus connective, 3 feels most connective to me. 1 feels more permissive to me, and I might get the impression that the instructor doesn't care about whether I come to class or not, and it certainly doesn't set any high expectations for my learning. The second one tends to focus a little bit more on obedience, and I might be getting an A in the class, but I got COVID and I needed to miss more than 3 classes. So there's, right, the first one has too much flexibility, the second doesn't have any, but this third one is emphasizing both flexibility and rigor. Next slide. Grading is another one where we run into conflict with students. We get into disagreements. Again, I'm going to invite you to indicate which of these seems more trauma-informed to you. The first one is implementing a revise and resubmit policy that requires students to track their changes. Second one is changing a student's grade because they're complaining loudly, even though it was a fair grade. 3 is failing an otherwise A paper because it was late. And I'm in agreement with you on that also. 1 strikes me as more trauma-informed because, again, it's emphasizing there's some flexibility, but there's rigor. I expect students to be able to identify their own mistakes, and I don't have to do extra work of identifying that. Oh, Phyllis is having fun with the slides. Okay. And then we can go to the next one. And then I'm sharing this one, and you'll see it in the toolbox also. No questions asked late days and no questions asked late policy. Out of all of the changes that I have made in my undergraduate and graduate courses, online or in person, the one that has had the most impact for students is this giving grace through late days and late work assignments. I've tried this both ways. Most recently with my graduate students, I've gone to unlimited late days. With undergraduate students, sometimes I do limited. This winter session, actually, I've gone to limited late days because we have a 4-week period, and students need the structure. Sometimes if they don't have the clear due dates, there's too much time, particularly some of them who may be more neurodiversity, ADHD, they need a deadline, right? And I ask them to email me and tell me it's going to be late and when they expect to hand it in, but there's no punishment and they don't have to tell me why they're handing it in late. There's no judgment. Sometimes students will still tell me why. And in that case, they're just looking for some empathy. And all I have to say is, wow, sounds like you're struggling with a lot right now. I'm really impressed that you've been, able to contact me and let me know it's going to be late. I look forward to seeing it, right? They just want an empathic response. The other second part of this is late assignments cannot earn a grade higher than a B. That has eliminated all conflict with students over grading. I have never had a student argue with me that if they turned it in late, they deserved an A on it, right? Or didn't become a big conflict, and they don't feel like they're being unjustly punished for it. So that has saved me a lot of doing a lot of work for policies, right? I can just have that blanket statement and that has worked beautifully. Next slide. And so then we have just a couple of scenarios, and Phyllis, we're about 10:20. So let's do this first one, engage the time so we have time for Q&A. So I want to perhaps even end with this scenario. I want you to imagine that you're feeling overwhelmed by the mountain of grading you must complete. Which of these 6 sound like more trauma-informed responses to you? And I'll invite you to use the chat. Sleeping less and drinking more caffeine so you can grade as usual. Does that sound? Maybe we rate these on a scale of 0 to 10. I know many of us are doing this and we laugh, but we do standard operating procedure with ourselves too. And trauma-informed care is about changing those standard operating procedures for ourselves also to make teaching and learning more accessible. How about stopping grading and giving all students a passing grade? Y'all get a B. Does that seem very trauma-informed? Probably not, right? Probably it certainly makes it more convenient, but then students aren't getting the feedback they need. Taking a break and letting students know to expect a delay. Some of you have indicated that one. Yeah, sometimes just being honest with students. Their anxiety is lessened if they just know what to expect, right? They don't need us to be perfect. They just need to know what to expect. I see a lot of scaffolding assignments and spacing due dates. Yeah, that can be so helpful for us as well as students, right? And then something that some of you may be toying with the idea of is ungrading or some type of self-evaluation on some assignments. Again, we don't have a lot of models for how we share power with students. The reality is that we are still the authority in the classroom, but we are creating ways together of how we empower students and how we share that authority with them in the classroom. Phyllis?
Yeah, I think that's
some great suggestions in the chat too.
They are wonderful suggestions. I was sitting here reading Bethesda's. It helps me to break it down into bite-sized goals and give myself permission to pause at certain points. Then I feel a level of accomplishment and relief. And I love that. I just want to amplify that, giving yourself permission just to pause. I think that's beautiful and certainly a trauma-informed practice. And recognizing that that this is a level of accomplishment. Yeah.
And Phyllis, do you want to do any more? Do make some time for Q&A? What are your
Let's
thoughts?
make some time for Q&A. Folks may have questions that they want to ask.
And then do we want to stop sharing so we can see people's faces or names?
I do, and I'm going to on the PowerPoint slide, when you get the slides, you'll have our resources, but you'll also have the link to the toolbox in your slides. And so we can stop sharing now.
And people are mentioning being honest with students, right? It can be hard to be vulnerable with students and to not be perfect. And we don't have to tell them a whole lot, right? Like we don't have to give them, no questions asked with us either. Hey, it's going to be late. I've got some stuff going on. Here's when you can expect it. Wally's got a hand up.
Yeah, thank you. So one of the things that I've been curious about is trying to be like a resilience-informed island in a rough sea of non-resilience-informed, I don't know, workers or culture or like if you're going to do something like this, you may be the only one in 30 of your colleagues who are doing it, or you may upset some students who like the old-fashioned authoritarian style of grading. And like, how do you exist? Like, how do you empower yourself? How do you recognize your own validity doing this when you're surrounded by people or cultures or organizations or entities that don't buy it, or are skeptical or resistant, or things like that?
Janice, you want to start?
Sure. So some of the tools that we've been mentioning, and I think that's one of the reasons we've been focusing on that self-compassion piece, is because we tend to think of trauma-informed or any change, right, as something that we do for students. And so we're trying to point out ways in which these strategies, skills, and attitudes can be used for ourselves, right? Validating yourself, thinking about the self-talk that you're using. And then we know with most change processes, if you want it to be something outside of your classroom, and while you know this well by looking at all the work that you're doing, you have to organize with others, and you have to find other like-minded people. And those other like-minded people might not use the exact same language that you're doing, but often they share the same values. And so even though trauma-informed is relatively new, and it certainly is new the way it's being integrated in higher education, we know people are doing stuff around universal design. We know people are doing stuff around anti-oppressive practice, critical theory. There are lots of ways in which we have commonalities with other people doing other similar types of work that we can band together and get support that way also. Phyllis?
Yeah, and I was just going to add something similar, is that we do share values. So if we're thinking about this in terms of ETSU, our mission is to respect all people, ideas, and thoughts, and we think about who we serve, and we all have the value of serving students. So that's a commonality that we bring. And whether the commonality is that we're working on community engaged learning, or we're in diversity, equity, and inclusion, or we're working in the SBI, we're working around those common values and walking those common values. And I think that's a great place to start. And remembering, like Janice mentioned, that we might have different words to call this, but we are focused around a common value.
And Jeannie has,
and we're already doing it. Oh yeah, I was going to say people are already doing that work. So to embrace that and leverage that, how that is a commonality. Sorry, Janice, go ahead.
No, I was just going to, Jeannie has a great comment in the chat, and I know Jeannie, and so Jeannie and I have been doing this work since people, like, before we even had names for it, right? And that's those small things that you do. It can be hard to understand that they make a really big difference over time. And so thank you for pointing that out, Jeannie, because you've seen, right? You've been tracking this. You've been involved with everybody I know who does this work, right? We see how those small changes over time really add up. Other comments, questions, feel free to raise a hand or unmute. I don't know if you can unmute.
While you're thinking, if you might have one last burning question, I want to mention that Lisa put the survey in the chat. So if you can just click on that, and you can do, it's a brief survey for the FBI, and to give Janice and I some feedback. There will be access to the PowerPoint slides, and they will. Michelle, you want to mention, or Ben, do they need to put their email address in the chat?
Yeah, if you haven't put your email in the chat, it would be really helpful. What our plan is to send you all the PowerPoint and the eval link, and an opportunity that Phyllis and Janice have if people are interested in their book. So we're going to send a email out afterwards. So please, if you haven't put your email in the chat, it would be really helpful for that follow-up email.
There are HBCU colleges implementing these practices, and some of them are documented in the book. Hopefully people are also getting published in journals with that too, but we are starting to see that, yeah.
And just in case you don't want to share your email, I've listed the link to the toolbox in the chat. And so you can just click on that link and you can get our toolbox from the book totally free of charge. Deidre, I'm glad you're here. And I'm glad you're updating your syllabus and today and maybe using some of these ideas that we shared or people in the conversation shared as well.
And Phyllis, I was just going to add, it would be so part of the evaluation is your thoughts about, what other things that the Strong Brain Resilience series could cover. If you have ideas for part 2 of this or something that you would like to present to do either at ETSU or broader, because we have folks from around the country here, please put that in the eval, because we are building this along with the community. So we appreciate all of your input. Great. Thank you, Phyllis. Janice, it was a great way to start the Monday morning. I hope for folks who are starting with their classrooms next week, this was an inspiration and giving them some thoughts of how starting the new semester. So thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for being here. We appreciate it. Bye.
Thank you all.